Hey guys, tonight we drift into a story that might feel a little too familiar, like that one dream you pretend you don't remember. You're lying there still, but your thoughts are anything but. The glow of your screen? Yeah, it's the only light in the room, but not the only thing pulling at you. The tension is quiet, but it hums like static in your chest. And honestly, if anyone really knew what you were thinking right now, you'd move to Antarctica and start a penguin choir just to avoid eye contact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Manchester? I want to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not proud of it. You wouldn't frame it and hang it on the wall, but this thing you carry, this private pull toward lust, it's with you more often than you'd admit. You walk around like you're fine, cracking jokes, posting memes, maybe even quoting verses now and then. But inside, you're dragging a secret. Not a monster, not a demon, just a hollow. It doesn't scream, it just whispers. Again. There's something exhausting about fighting the same temptation over and over. You delete the app, you uninstall, you fast, you read, you even Google, why do I keep falling into sin at 2:47 a.m. while halfway through repenting and halfway through reloading the page? You make deals with God. One more time and then never again. But it's not really about the deal, is it? It's about the ache. The ache that somehow always comes back, usually when you're most alone. The early church fathers used to write about lux moe, those persistent thoughts that return like waves to the mind. Lust was one of them. They said it didn't just aim at the body, but at the soul's memory of Eden. That's something, isn't it? That your struggle might actually be evidence of your spiritual homesickness, like your body's trying to recreate a comfort it vaguely remembers, but with broken tools. And no, this isn't just you being quote-unquote weak. Let's retire that word for tonight. Weak is what a phone battery gets. What you're feeling, that's more layered than anyone around you probably realizes. Especially when the people closest to you say things like, just stop thinking about it. Cute advice. Maybe next they'll recommend not being human. Now, here's a strange fact. Did you know ancient Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, your heart would be weighed against a feather? If your heart was heavier, you'd be devoured by a monster with the head of a crocodile. Charming, I know, but it's kind of poetic, right? That somewhere deep in the ancient world, people already sensed that what weighed you down inside would determine your fate. You think no one sees, that no one knows how heavy it is to carry this alone. But there's this moment, maybe it's now, or maybe it was last night, when your thumb hovered over a link and something in you paused. That part of you that's still fighting, still reaching. That's not failure. That's faith refusing to die quietly. Some theologians argue whether Paul's thorn in the flesh was a physical ailment or a persistent temptation. The debate still goes on. What we do know is that he begged God 3 times to take it away, and God said no. Not out of cruelty, but because strength made perfect in weakness isn't a metaphor, it's survival theology. You're not a glitch in the system. You're not defective because you struggle. In fact, the struggle itself might be the clearest sign that you haven't given in completely. Lust is sneaky because it doesn't always look ugly. Sometimes it comes dressed in beauty, in loneliness, in the craving to just be seen. And that's the part you don't say out loud, that behind it all, you want someone to choose you, not just for a moment, but forever. Remember when you used to build sand castles and yell "mine" when someone got too close? Yeah, your soul still does that. Except now, the castle's made of fantasy and your fingers type instead of mold wet sand. But underneath it, same longing, to claim, to be claimed. You tell yourself it's just biology, that everyone's doing it, that it's not that bad. And maybe that helps for a second. But then you wake up the next day and your soul feels foggy. Not guilty, just grayed out, like someone lowered the contrast on your spirit. What if I told you this fog has been walked through by saints and prophets and tired, messy, holy people for centuries? That you're not just some messed up exception, but part of a lineage of the limping. There's dignity in the crawl, especially when you still have the audacity to pray even after you fall. Maybe tonight you're not meant to escape the weight. Not yet. Maybe you're just meant to feel it fully. Every ache, every silent plea, every breath you take in the dark. Because the first step to being healed is letting yourself be known, even if only by God. And He knows. He knows you click before you think. He knows you stare a little longer. He knows the late-night logic that makes sin sound like a solution. And still, He's not ashamed to be near you, not even a little bit. So tonight, don't run from the heaviness. Lay in it. Let it speak. Let it name what it wants. Then, gently, ask if what it wants will really feed the deeper hunger. You might be surprised at what you hear back.
You wake up and try to shake off the fog, but it clings to your skin like sweat after a bad dream. The struggle from the night before hasn't gone anywhere. It's curled up in the corner, waiting. Lust doesn't knock. It just shows up like some unwanted roommate who knows the spare key is still under your doormat. And worse, it doesn't always come looking monstrous. Sometimes it arrives looking like comfort. You think desire's the problem, but desire's just the messenger. It's not evil. It's honest. It points to something deeper, something tender you've stopped naming. You tell yourself it's just physical, but let's be real. If it were only about the body, it wouldn't leave your spirit so sore the next morning. Every urge tells a story. Yours is written in the quiet moments. Those pauses in your day when your heart starts scanning the room for something more. And that's the twist most people don't catch. Lust isn't about sex, not really. Lust is about reaching for connection in a disconnected world. It's about wanting to be desired without having to be known. You crave the attention, not just the act. You want someone to look at you and say, "You're worth the gaze," even if it's just for 5 seconds. Even if it's artificial. That's the scariest part, right? You're afraid the only kind of intimacy you can control is the one you manufacture. The ancient Greeks had this odd little myth about Narcissus, the guy who saw his reflection in a pool and fell in love with it. But the original story wasn't just about vanity. It was about someone who mistook the image for the real thing. He didn't recognize that the water only echoed what he projected. That's you, sometimes. You chase digital reflections and emotional fantasies thinking they'll answer something. But all they ever do is mirror your ache back at you. There's a deeper story here, one no one warned you about. Lust acts like a mirror, not a true one, a distorted one, like those funhouse carnival mirrors that make your head 3 feet tall and your worth 3 inches wide. It reflects back not just what you want, but what you fear you lack. Some nights, you don't even know what you're trying to feel. You just need to feel something. It's not about being turned on, it's about being turned toward. There's a difference, and you know it. Here's something curious. During the Middle Ages, Christian monks living in the desert talked about acedia, a strange kind of spiritual boredom. They said it was the noonday demon, the one that made you restless, made prayer feel pointless, made even sin look interesting. And guess what emotion it shared a root with? Lust. Not because it's the same thing, but because both creep in when you're trying to avoid silence. Because silence, for some of us, feels like abandonment. And that's where the mirror gets sharper. Because lust doesn't always say, "Give me pleasure." Sometimes it says, "Just don't leave me alone again." That part,
that hits a little different. You start to notice patterns, like how certain times of day feel more dangerous than others, or how being tired makes you more reckless. And slowly, you realize you've trained yourself to reach for artificial comfort when real comfort feels impossible. It's like your soul has muscle memory for numbing. And here's the weird truth no one's eager to say. The temptation you hate might actually be trying to save you from the pain you haven't named yet. It's trying, in its clumsy way, to feel something real. It's just really bad at it. That's why it feels so confusing. Because you're not just fighting lust, you're fighting loneliness, fear, grief, boredom, abandonment. You're fighting every unresolved moment that still lingers in your nervous system like a ghost. Some psychologists suggest that compulsive desire is often just unprocessed pain wearing a different outfit. It shows up dressed like seduction, but when it takes the mask off, it's usually rejection or shame or that unresolved childhood moment when someone made you feel invisible. That brings us to a historical truth you might not expect. The early Christian celibates, like Antony of Egypt, didn't run from lust by suppressing it. They stared it in the face. Literally. They believed temptation wasn't just something to resist. It was a mirror that showed them who they really were under pressure. They called it ascesis, the discipline of being undistracted long enough to let God reveal the truth. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some later theologians argued that too much focus on self-denial could create more obsession. The debate never really ended. Even today, scholars still ask, does resisting desire sanctify you, or just make you secretly obsessed with it? But let's bring it back to you, because theory doesn't help much when your hands are shaken and your resolve is thin. In the end, all you really want is to be okay. You want to be loved without the fine print, seen without being sold to, and maybe, just maybe, held without having to give yourself away. You're not wrong for wanting that, but maybe lust is just the counterfeit version of the connection you were built for. It promises to hold you, but always leaves you emptier. It promises control, but hands you over to chaos. And that's not your fault, but it is your fight. You're learning, slowly, to look past the mirror, to see beyond the blur of craving and find the wound underneath. And that's where things start to shift. Not instantly, not cleanly, but honestly. So maybe tonight, instead of fighting the urge head-on, you sit with it like a strange visitor. You ask it questions. You trace its roots. And in doing that, you start to reclaim your power, not by pretending the struggle doesn't exist, but by refusing to let it define you. You're not your urges, you're not your history, and you're definitely not just the sum of what you click. You're a soul in process, and the mirror is starting to crack.
You didn't plan to end up here. No one does. You were aiming for something good, something warm, something holy even. Then one day, you look around and the map in your hand has turned to ash. You keep telling yourself it's just a detour, just a phase, just stress. But deep down, something whispers, what if I'm always like this? But here's the thing they never taught you in Sunday school. God sometimes designs the wilderness. Yeah, I know, that sounds like a cosmic betrayal. You picture God as a guide with a lantern, not an architect of dry places. But there's this strange truth that keeps showing up in the old stories. He doesn't always lead people into peace and plenty. Sometimes he leads them into deserts. You remember the Israelites, right? Delivered from slavery with plagues and parted seas, only to be marched straight into a wasteland. 40 years of sand, thirst, and complaining. Not because God was lost, not because they were being punished, but because they needed to become something that Egypt had trained out of them. something wilderness alone could rebuild. That's where you are. Not banished, not cursed, just being rebuilt. It doesn't feel noble, though. Most days, it feels like failure in a trench coat. You pray, but the words feel dry. You try accountability, but your confessions start to sound like reruns. And then there are those nights when the temptation doesn't come with fangs, but with softness. It waits until your guard is down, then wraps around you like a warm blanket with barbed wire on the inside. But God is not surprised by your patterns. He's not pacing heaven like, wow, didn't expect that click. No, he's been walking with the tempted for centuries, from David to Peter to that monk who scribbled prayers in the margins while sweating through temptation in a stone cell. There's this moment in the Gospels that gets overlooked. Right after Jesus is baptized, literally, the heavens open, a dove descends, God the Father booms, "This is my Son, whom I love." And then, straight into the wilderness. No pit stop, no victory lap, just sand, silence, and Satan. It's almost like God says, now that you know who you are, let's find out who you'll be when it gets hard. And maybe that's where you are. Not in sin, not in shame, but in process, in testing, in the sacred, gritty space between identity and transformation. The wilderness isn't where faith goes to die. It's where faith learns to walk without crutches. Here's a weird historical nugget. In 17th century France, some Catholics practiced something called anchorus living. They'd literally wall themselves into tiny rooms attached to churches, living in silence and prayer, voluntarily, for years. Some people thought it was a form of madness. Others said it was the highest form of love. Either way, it was isolation, but with intention. You haven't walled yourself into a cell, but your temptations have tried to do it for you. They want to trap you in shame, to convince you that your weakness disqualifies you. But here's the scandalous, beautiful truth. God can use your temptation to make you holy. Some theologians argue that temptation isn't just something to avoid. It's a tool that reveals your true desires, your true gods. That in resisting or relapsing, you're forced to name what you actually worship. It's uncomfortable theology. Not everyone agrees. Some insist temptation is only a test. Others say it's a teacher.
Either way, here you are, in a desert that doesn't make sense, praying to a God who sometimes feels just out of reach. And yet, something in you hasn't let go. Even when you stumble, even when you swear you're done trying, there's still that quiet, stubborn spark, some part of you that whispers, I want more than this. You're not as far gone as you feel. Do you remember how manna worked? God fed the Israelites one day at a time. No hoarding, no leftovers. You either trusted Him for the next meal, or you went hungry. Temptation has its own kind of manna, except the real sustenance isn't avoiding the urge. It's learning to return to God daily, again and again, even after you've fallen face first into the dust. This isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming familiar with grace. Not the cheap kind, the real kind. The kind that meets you mid-scroll, mid-shame, mid-repeat, and says, you're still mine. You've been trying to white-knuckle your way through this wilderness, thinking holiness is about strength. But what if it's about surrender? Not surrender to the craving, but surrender to the one who waits for you behind it. Because here's the truth they don't always preach. God doesn't just meet you after you're clean. He walks with you in the middle of your mess. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't look away. He's the kind of God who enters deserts, who walks with the wounded, who stays present even when your hands tremble. So maybe tonight you stop trying to escape the wilderness. Maybe you pitch your tent and call this sacred ground. Not because it's easy, but because God is here, and He's not done writing your story yet. The wilderness is brutal, but it's not barren.
It starts with something small. Maybe you skip a prayer. Maybe you mute that twinge of conviction with a playlist or a snack or a scroll. Maybe you tell yourself it's not a big deal, just this once. But the thing about lust is, it's a quiet thief. It doesn't steal your faith in one grand heist. It drains it slowly, drop by drop, while your back is turned. You already know this. You've seen how days blur together when shame takes the wheel. You know the cycle, the build-up, the act, the crash. The resolve that lasts exactly 1.5 days. The whispered promises to God that you mean it this time, followed by that little voice saying, "He's probably tired of hearing from you." But here's what you need to remember. Shame is a liar that wears God's voice like a costume. Guilt says you did something wrong. Shame says you are something wrong. And that distinction, that's life and death. Because the deeper lie of lust isn't just about desire, it's about identity. It whispers, "This is who you are. This is all you'll ever be." And the moment you believe that, you stop fighting. Not because you want to sin, but because you don't think freedom belongs to people like you. But it does. Oh, it does. You're not caught in this cycle because you're weak. You're caught because you're human. And humans were never meant to carry their battles alone. That's part of the sabotage. Lust isolates. It convinces you to hide, to perform, to make your prayers polite. But God, He doesn't need your mask. He wants your mess. Think back to Adam and Eve. The first time shame entered the world, what did they do? They hid. They covered. They avoided God. But God, He came looking. Not with thunder, not with judgment, but with a question. Where are you? And maybe that's the question tonight. Not what have you done, not how could you, just where are you? Because healing doesn't begin with fixing your behavior. It begins with showing up. There's a strange fact buried in medieval church history. Confession used to be public, like stand up in front of everyone public. People would name their sins aloud during Mass. It sounds horrifying now, but back then, it reminded them they weren't alone, that everyone was a work in progress, that grace wasn't just vertical, it was communal. Today, of course, we've moved to private booths and discrete apps, but that ache for connection, for being known and not rejected, it's still there, and you feel it most when lust tricks you into silence. You've tried willpower, you've tried distraction, maybe you've even tried spiritual rituals like fasting or cold showers or muting your phone after 9 p.m. But what if the key isn't in doing more? What if it's in being honest? There's a kind of power that only comes when you let someone see the whole picture. Not the curated version, not the "I'm fine, just struggling a little" version, but the real thing, the late-night grief, the compulsive clicking, the fear that maybe God's disappointed in you. Because here's the twist, He's not even a little. You think God is tired of you, but grace doesn't get exhausted. You think He's rolling His eyes in heaven, but Scripture paints Him as the shepherd who runs toward the lost, the Father who sprints down the road, the God who bakes breakfast for the disciple who betrayed Him. Even in your lust, God leans in. Now, that doesn't mean He shrugs it off. No, He's deadly serious about your soul. But He's not disgusted by your struggle. He sees the ache beneath it. He knows the unmet need, the lonely child still living in your adult body, the trauma you've normalized, the patterns you inherited, and still, He stays. Some theologians say sanctification is not a ladder you climb, but a spiral staircase you slowly ascend, even as you circle familiar struggles. You're not back at the bottom. You're just revisiting old wounds from a new height. Others disagree. They argue that true freedom should look more linear, less relapse, more victory. The truth? Both views carry weight, and the tension between them mirrors your life. Some days feel like progress, others like Groundhog Day. But healing doesn't always feel like a breakthrough. Sometimes it's just waking up and choosing honesty again, choosing presence again, choosing to believe that God's not going anywhere again. So tonight, maybe you do something wild. Maybe you stop measuring your worth by your record. Maybe you let yourself be loved before you've earned it. Because, spoiler, you can't. And that's the scandal of grace. It offends every instinct in you that says you have to get your act together first. But Jesus never said, clean yourself up and then follow me. He said, come, just as you are, bruised, weary, tempted, addicted, longing, loved. So you open your heart, cracked as it is. You whisper a prayer that barely qualifies as one, and you trust, just for tonight, that God sees it and smiles. Not because you've beaten the struggle, but because you're still here.
You're not even sure when the line blurred. At first, it felt like a war. You versus temptation. Swords drawn, prayers loaded like arrows. But over time, the urgency faded. You started calling it a thorn. You told yourself everyone has one. And while that's technically true, there's a difference between carrying a thorn and letting it become your pillow. Sometimes it's not the craving itself that keeps you trapped. It's the numbness, the slow, gray drip of resignation that convinces you this is just your life now. That holiness is for monks and missionaries, that people like you, messy, tempted, inconsistent, are spiritual footnotes at best. But that's not how the kingdom works. You're not a footnote. You're the page he's still writing. Maybe you remember that story, Jacob wrestling the angel all night, limping by sunrise. It's always romanticized, but if you zoom in, it's kind of chaotic. A man in the dark fighting for a blessing he doesn't fully understand. And what does he get for his trouble? A new name and a permanent limp. That's you. You've been wrestling too long to walk away unchanged. This struggle is branding you, not with shame, but with authenticity. You're becoming someone who knows how to cling to God even when the blessing feels slow, even when the wound still stings. There's a bizarre detail in ancient Roman history that might resonate with you. Victorious generals were sometimes paraded through the streets after battle, but behind them, a slave would whisper repeatedly, "Remember, you are mortal." A reminder that victory didn't make them gods, that they were still breakable. Maybe tonight you need a different whisper. Remember, you are beloved. Not because you've conquered lust, not because your mind is pure, but because God's affection doesn't shrink to fit your performance. He loves you at full volume, even when you're curled up in defeat. You've had glimpses of this before, those weird, holy moments when God shows up uninvited, like when you cried for no reason during a worship song you didn't even like, or when you walked out of the house feeling disgusting and somehow the sunlight still kissed your face like you were clean. He sees you. He always has. And it's not just about feeling better. God's not in the business of handing out spiritual band-aids. He wants wholeness, which, ironically, often starts with being broken in the right direction. Some people think wholeness means freedom from desire, but maybe it's actually about integration, where the divided pieces of you stop fighting each other and learn to kneel together.
Your longing, your fear, your habits, even your cravings, all of them brought into the light, not as enemies, but as raw material for redemption.
You've been trying to compartmentalize, keep your lust in one box and your faith in another, but the boxes are breaking. And that's not failure, that's invitation. Let God into the whole house, even the messy parts, especially the messy parts. There's an ancient Eastern Christian practice called hesychasm, a form of silent inner prayer that repeats just one line over and over. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Not dramatic, not emotional, just a heartbeat of humility, whispered on repeat until the words become your breath. You don't need to master that tonight, but maybe you start with something just as small, like naming your temptation out loud, like texting someone trustworthy before the moment hits, like praying after you fail instead of hiding for 3 days first. Because failure doesn't make you unholy, hiding does. Some theologians argue that sin creates a kind of spiritual amnesia, where we forget who we are and whose we are. That's why confession matters. Not just to clear the record, but to remember the truth. You're not your lowest moment. You're not your last mistake. You're still His. Others push back, saying confession should be joyful, not just tearful. That we should run into God's presence with boldness, not crawl in like criminals. And maybe the healthiest path is somewhere in between. Bold, but not blind. Humble, but not hopeless. So tonight, you sit with the tension. You don't rush to solve it. You just admit, I'm not okay, but I'm not alone. That, right there, that's sacred ground. You can't shortcut transformation. You can't hack holiness with productivity apps and filtered journaling pages, but you can show up. You can ask for help. You can choose to believe that this desert has a river running underneath it, waiting for you to dig deep enough to find it. So you keep digging, with tears, with therapy, with temptation breathing down your neck, because even when you're exhausted and ashamed and half believing, God is still the one who calls dry bones to life. And you're not dead. You're not done. You're just mid-story.
You're more tired than you let on. It's not just the battle with lust, it's the battle about the battle. The constant calculation. Did I mess up too much this week? Can I still pray? Am I even growing? It's like trying to swim with a backpack full of bricks and smiling for the camera at the same time. But here's a quiet truth no one tells you. Spiritual fatigue isn't failure. It's friction. It means your soul still cares. A dead heart doesn't wrestle. A hardened spirit doesn't grieve. So the fact that you feel tired, guilty, confused, that's proof you haven't gone numb yet. That's proof God's still working. You've been walking through this wilderness so long, you've memorized the dunes. You know where the triggers hide. You know the scripts, the cycle, the false highs and real lows. But even deserts end. Even this. What if lust isn't the test, but the teacher? Not in the cruel way religion sometimes frames it, like God's watching with a red pen grading every impulse. No. What if it's the thing that keeps dragging you back to the one place you actually meet God raw and real? Your knees. That's been the pattern all along, hasn't it? You fall, you panic, you repent. You feel small. You whisper your need, and somehow, in that moment, the noise fades. The shame shuts up. The silence starts to feel holy again. Lust is not your identity. It's not your legacy. It's not even your greatest threat. Your greatest threat is forgetting the voice that calls you beloved. And the enemy? He doesn't care if you sin. He cares if you stop coming back. There's a strange old Jewish tradition about the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. But they didn't see it as a pure enemy. They believed that even our darkest urges were given space in God's economy, that without desire, there'd be no drive, no art, no families, no movement. The trick wasn't to kill the urge, but to reorder it. What if that's the next step for you? Not just resisting lust, but rerouting it, redirecting that hunger towards something holy. Not just muting the desire, but transforming it, so that passion becomes purpose, so that longing births love. Some scholars argue that sanctification is not a straight line, but a series of conversions. First your mind, then your heart, then your habits, then your imagination. And maybe now you're standing at the door of that last one, learning to see the world and yourself as God does. Others disagree. They say the process is simpler. Grace comes, sin flees. But if you're honest, your story hasn't been that tidy. Your path winds, your steps backtrack, but your heart keeps turning homeward again and again. And maybe that's the point. Maybe holiness isn't a place you arrive, it's a direction you keep choosing. So tonight, you choose it again. Not with fireworks, but with a whisper. You sit there, breath slow, heart raw, spine soft. No grand declarations, just this small, stubborn act of presence. You're not hiding. You're not pretending. You're just here. And so is he. Still here. Still yours. Still calling you by name, even when you forget it yourself. You're not finished. You're not disqualified. You're not too far gone. This isn't just a setback. It's sacred ground. The very soil where your healing is growing. Invisible and stubborn. Just beneath the surface. You may not see it yet, but heaven does. And it's smiling.
Let your breath soften now. Let your eyes go heavy. You've made it through tonight's journey, even if parts of it were hard to hear. You're not alone in that. Not ever. The sounds around you are quieter now. The room is darker. You're safe. Whatever images or memories linger, let them blur softly into the background, like mist melting off a lake at sunrise. No need to solve anything now. No fixing. Just being. Just resting. Imagine God watching over you, not as a judge, but as a shepherd at the edge of campfire light, keeping watch while you sleep. His gaze is gentle. His patience is endless. Even when your eyes close, his don't. You don't need to be perfect tomorrow. You don't even need to be strong. Just be open, be honest, be held. So let go. Let grace wrap around your weary heart like a blanket still warm from the dryer. And as your thoughts slow and your breath deepens, just know this: you are seen, you are loved, you are already enough.